We just had a really great, my wife and I, great day. We went to the Montpelier Henry Knox house, which is just an off-the-charts national treasure. We went to the Olson house, which is so brilliant the way it's presented. I just thought we got this great tour from Nancy, and it was just an incredible experience. What it does is unpack and recontextualize these houses. And it's just, it helps people appreciate what they've got and see them in a different way. And I think that's sort of the purpose of my program as well tonight, is to help us see these wonderful little time capsules and house museums in a different way. House museums and community-based historical organizations serve, document, and reflect their communities like few things left in our world. Yet they face challenges to sustainability even as their relevance and value has never been greater. And I had somebody who was sort of a marketing guy once explain to me that the sweet spot for marketing is when there's a big gap between the reality and the perception. So the perception sometimes, they don't house museums. The reality is these are really important. And that's an opportunity, I think, to change the way people think. So that's the way I believe that I got into this business, and I was in Vermont, and I started out in a historical society in a small town, not that small, Middlebury, Vermont, but that's why I'm in this business, because I just fell in love with the town and with this little museum. And so about 8 years ago, when the head of the National Trust for Historic Preservation comes out with this big essay and this big new agenda that there are too many house museums. Thank you for the help. What have you done for us lately? Too many house museums. Well, there might be too many, but that's not the message we should be putting out there. The message is how important these things are. And I said what's missing from this is again, this message that house museums and community-based historical organizations offer, again, as the introduction said, inspirational experiences, extraordinary teaching tools. They invented historic preservation, and it was fun at the Montpelier today to talk about the DAR, because God, they did everything. The DAR and the colonial dames started everything. You know, they were 100 years ago. There was no Williamsburg, there was no Deerfield, there was no Strawberry Bank. There weren't half the art museums there are in the country, but these women were out there building this stuff. We'll talk about that. Anyway, so the message is that so they practically invented historic preservation, and these things are a refuge, as the Farnsworth Museum has become, for local knowledge at a time when this whole thing about the sameness of the world and the chain stores everywhere and the homogenization that is really eroding our sense of civic attachment is happening everywhere. So these are little oases that I think help us connect to our communities, and that's really important. Repositories of localism, the best of these historical organizations do what they do with sometimes breathtaking frugality and a heavy reliance on volunteers. What is not to love? So that's, you know, and when the National Trust got on its little hobby horse about too many house museums, I kind of reached for my gun. Drawn from an investigation of hundreds of local and regional collections throughout the Northeast and beyond, this program examines the role of house museums and historical societies in preserving and fostering community by showcasing some of these inspirational models. I will make a case for house museums and community historical organizations by arguing that there are, again, few institutions left in our civilization that so richly encapsulate the quality, character, and diversity of American life. As experiential learning environments, they are unrivaled and necessary. The cultural diversity they represent is not unlike biodiversity that we talk about. We lose or abuse it at our peril, and these are just some of the places here and there. As I say, no two of them are alike. Those are some of my DAR friends from Windsor, Connecticut. And just at the time of the John Brown 150th of Harper's Ferry, and did a little exhibit. They were rifling through their attic at one of the DAR properties in Connecticut and turned up a daguerreotype of one of John Brown's raiders, taken of him posing with his sister the night before he was hanged. That is a huge artifact, a really important thing, and these are the kinds of discoveries one again, makes all the time. America doesn't need another house museum. Say what? And my first contact with this business was through an inspiring pair of house museums in Western Vermont. My most fulfilling experiences in this business have involved small museums, and my consulting practice now is about, when I have museum clients, as I put it, turning C's into B's and B's into A's, and marshaling the resources and community spirit needed to realize potential and demonstrate that these places are where our cultural DNA is stored, and the memories that matter most can be used, how they can be used and experienced. As I like to put it, imagine, let me go back to this, imagine the Smithsonian if it was bottom-up, grassroots, and evenly dispersed across the country. Quadruple its diversity and complexities, and that's what we have. Indeed, half of our nation's cultural patrimony, this, which is like the cool stuff, that we want to preserve, half is housed in small museums. And you go, how's that possible? Because they outnumber big museums 20-1. Small museums are also where many great discoveries will be made, and of course, while they are doing all that, they're also sparing thousands of historic buildings from the ravages of fashion and remodeling. So, so here we go. Despite accounts of too many house museums, the inescapable truth is that there's hardly an institutional, educational, or commercial genre in modern life more variegated and distinctive. Most historical society collections are the antithesis of homogeneous, and what they are doing in and for their communities is often an underreported triumph. At their best, they are defining the role of museums in public life, and against all odds, preserving emblems of culture and communities more genuine than flags in football, more peaceful than religions, and in ways that are organic, grounded, and centered in places that matter. The problem is not that we have too many house museums, is that there has been an appalling disregard by foundations, granting agencies, and even our partners in historic preservation to the needs of small to mid-sized house museums and community-based organizations. Preservation isn't just about saving the built environment and tax credits, but it is also about content, stories, collections, and civic spirit, so richly encapsulated in these organizations. Caring and raising the bar of support and visibility is not only the least preservationists can do, it's the best we can do. And it's so what's with all this, disparagement? And, for people who say, well, who cares, and nobody visits them, and they're go to Charleston, South Carolina, if you want to see house museums with people lined up every day, year after year, month after month. The demand is huge because the quality is huge and because the overall destination experience is huge. But even if you're not Charleston, there's so many fascinating places. Actually, on the upper left is Charleston, the Aiken Red House. Upper right is also Charleston. It's Fort Sumter. But this building in the center is a house museum in Crown Point, New York, called Penfield, that is just brilliant. And, do they get 5,000 visitors a year? Maybe not. But gosh, am I glad it exists. And I'm so glad every time I get a chance to visit it. Well, let's go back a little bit further and talk about the origins of public history. And, how we as a nation, when we became self-conscious about our past, didn't start with museums. It started with art and literature. People like artist John Trumbull with his famous scene of the John Trumbull's Declaration of Independence, Daniel Chester French's depiction of the Minuteman, Henry Longfellow's Hanging of the Crane. He also wrote books like The Courtship of Miles Standish and Paul Revere's Ride. These writers gave powerful expression to widely shared values. They played an important role in creating a sense of past for a nation that wasn't aware that it had one. Then right after the Civil War, there are a few instances before, but by and large, the antiquarian collecting museum thing really starts in the 1870s. And these are some of my heroes, really. Henry Sheldon from Middlebury, Vermont. That's where I got started with all this. He was a genius. And George Sheldon, his cousin from Deerfield, he's the reason Deerfield is what it is. He was a genius. And my favorite is the guy in the center there, George Dudley Seymour. And we'll hear more about him in a moment. And he was from New Haven. And I think he was kind of a civic genius. And these are these museums that happen to have been founded in the 1870s, which is like really early. And it's great if you are collecting stuff that would later become really valuable, if you can pick it up in dumps and pawing around people's attics because it hasn't achieved any antique value yet. And this guy, Henry Sheldon, I know a little bit more about in Vermont. He was famous. People would die, and he wouldn't even wait. Like the hearse wouldn't even have pulled out of the driveway before he's like rummaging around in the attic. And he just was just a truffle hound, trying to get all the public records and and he documented everything so scrupulously. So it's really an incredible time capsule of Middlebury history. Middlebury College is situated in a town that is better documented than any town its size in New England. It's staggering, the documentation. All you have to do is hire faculty that understand why that matters. It is, and these are some of the things at the Sheldon Museum, and there are lots of great things. Every object has, of course, a story because Henry Sheldon documented everything. Everything, it's not a collection of antiques, it's a collection of material culture with provenance and storylines behind them. And, you know, it's also decorative arts. One of the really cool things Henry Sheldon did, he collected libraries. Now, what's that about? He decided that it was important, this is an amazing idea to me, in the 1880s, he decided that it was important to know what the first minister and the first lawyers and the educated people at the birth of the town, what they were reading. What a concept. So he would hustle their descendants and say, look, you don't want those old books. I will preserve Grandpa's library intact. And I love this. On the right it says first Middlebury book. You see on the spine there, he'd put sometimes these little paper labels. What that is actually is a little different. Middlebury, Vermont was also a printing center, and it was the first book printed in Middlebury. But so he would collect these things. And then there's this George Dudley Seymour, who was, they called him Mr. New Haven. He actually got an honorary degree from Yale University for his role, try to wrap your head around this, for his role in healing and nurturing town-gown relationships. This guy was such a civic force of nature that he was able to break down the barriers at Yale. And I'm sure, you know, not to say that Yale or Bowdoin or Harvard, I'm sure all these elite institutions at one time were up here on Mount Olympus, and the locals were like, you know, walled out, and that's the way these cultures work. But he helped fix that, and he built a relationship between New Haven and Yale that is actually part of Yale's identity now, and it's now been for 100 years. He was also a preservationist who would, every time it was knocking down a historic building, he out of his own pocket would hire photographers to go in and document the buildings. This is in 1905. Document these buildings before they were demolished. He was also a collector, and he was obsessed with Nathan Hale. He was also involved in city planning. He brought Frederick Law Olmsted and Cass Gilbert in to do the first city plan for New Haven in 1910. He was a great friend with the founders. Gifford Pinchot was the founder of the American Forestry Service. Helped give birth to the National Park Service. So he had all these networks. He was also a patent attorney and a collector, and he saved, in 1914, this was early for a house museum, he bought Nathan Hale's house, restored it and opened it to the public, and then wound up donating it to the organization where I was formerly the director. And it's, you know, this is what his life was about. Already mentioned the women. I think the women leaders in this business outnumbered the men probably 5 to 1. I'm not going to say quite 10 to 1. But imagine that the first president general, the first regent of the DAR, was a sitting first lady of the United States. This is Carolyn Scott Harrison. The DAR, at the time that women got the vote, this is a whole program in itself, time women got the vote in 1920, the Daughters of the American Revolution was the largest organized voting bloc, organized women's group in the country. So in terms of mobilizing votes, in those days, in the 20s and 30s, when the Daughters of the American Revolution invited the president to speak to their annual Congress, as they called it, in Washington, the response they always got was, "What time do you need me?" I mean, you know, they wouldn't even ask today because the answer would never be yes. But in those days it was, because this is, as I like to put it, these heritage organizations were not only greatly empowered by women, but actually women were empowered by heritage, because this was a public work that women could do at a time when they couldn't even vote, and it really became sort of a platform for learning parliamentary procedures and organization. Really great stuff. And this is another one of my heroes, Emily Holcomb. She was from Hartford, and she was a one-woman preservation society. She helped furnish the Oliver Ellsworth House when the usual suspects decided to bulldoze the Connecticut Old State House to put in a designed by Charles Bulfinch, lower left, for a parking lot or a parking garage. She and the colonial dame, she was involved in both the dames and the DAR, stood up to the wrecking ball and raised a bunch of money and dragged this agenda through the mud and stopped it. And she saved that. She did the first major restoration of historic cemetery in the country, and she organized at the St. Louis and then later at the Jamestown World's Fairs the largest displays of antiques that had ever been brought before the public before. In 1904, 520 objects that she rounded up. So she was like super type A, and she just did all this cool stuff. So that's the history of this. Where are we now? Well, the house museums that get the most attention, and look, you know, going to the Olson House today, it's fabulous, and what you do with it is great, but you take the Wyeth name out of the equation, and it's just another house. So yes, celebrity matters, and fame matters, and people are going to go there because of this Wyeth connection. And people go to these places because of it's about celebrities, you know, and the celebrities in this case happen to be George Washington. He's a forever celebrity, upper right. Frederick Church, the artist, most successful artist in 19th century America, upper left. Thomas Jefferson, lower left, and then Mark Twain on the right. These are the kind of house museums that, I mean, Mount Vernon does 800,000 visitors a year. So that's like big business. And then there's all these places that nobody's ever heard of that are so extraordinary, and why I just keep at it, because I just love this stuff. These community-based historical organizations, but most do something that are, I think, even more important than the celebrity worship. They're, again, repositories for civic memory that preserve the stuff and stories of their communities, often housed in buildings that matter, in places that matter, doing work that absolutely matters. Guy Alexander Twilight graduated in the 1820s, got a degree from Middlebury, and he went off and founded the Orleans County Grammar School in this building, and it's now this community museum in this beautiful little town that they interpret, and it's, you know, look, this is not stated, this is not a, you know, Michael Komanecki production, but you know what, the stuff is good, and every town in the county has a room. And so every spring when they reopen, they're always kind of duking it out to see who will have the coolest new thing that they rustled up over the winter. But, you know, again, you find things that and in some cases the upholstery. Look in the upper right there, those are two wicker chairs with their original sort of folky, funky fabric treatments. I don't know how else to describe it, but that stuff never survives. And one of the many sub-themes of these local small museums is they preserve things that have eluded art museums and have eluded the Smithsonian. Fish that got away from every other stream wind up sometimes preserved in these, and they're great. Many of you, if you're interested in quilting and know about friendship quilts, does that ring a bell to anybody? There's a whole genre of women's art that is about social relationships, and these friendship quilts sort of encapsulate networks of friends. This thing on the left is a friendship ladder. I'd never seen one, but it does the same thing. Each fabric is inscribed with biographical information about a network of friends. So these are just some things, and I would love to do an exhibit on hair wreath art, because I'm sure I have the largest photograph collection in the world, because I'm always finding examples. That's a really good one, where you've got actually the portrait of the artist embedded in the middle of her artwork, but some of this stuff is really spectacular. I do have no explanation for why this fish has hair, but we don't know. We're going to have to make a second trip back and find out. There must be a long version. But these are all things that this Brownington Old Stonehouse Museum up in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, and every artifact has a backstory. There's no art museum up there, but if you want to see the local art, you go there, and that's what you're going to find. This place is so emotional for me. One of the big epic stories of the state of Massachusetts. how in the 1920s, by, eminent domain and decree, they wrote a death sentence for 4 towns: Enfield, Dana, Salem, Prescott, Greenwich, 5 towns. And these were towns that existed like all these little New England towns, and they said, look, Boston needs more water. So it's over for you guys. Everybody move out, and then we're gonna build a dam, and then we're gonna start flooding this basin. And so these 5 towns are underwater. Well, they had a few years to plan on all this, and I'm sure the people were paid something. These were rural towns. And so one of their consolation prizes was that they got a little state support to help preserve things, to move things. They actually moved cemeteries and relocated them to higher ground. But this Swift River Valley Historical Society in New Salem, Massachusetts, it's almost like a 9/11 monument. That's a kind of Holocaust for a community, when your ancestry, your buildings, everything in your memory. And when I look at how you interpret the Olsons and the idea that these people were rooted in place and they didn't travel a lot, this was Christina's world. Well, there were thousands of Christinas in these 5 towns whose world was obliterated. So this museum is just so richly infused with the emotions that go with that, and they've got such amazing stuff, and I won't dwell on it, but it is well worth a detour, as is the old Fort Museum in Fort Edward, New York. Founded in 1920, it has grown to include a 3-acre museum campus, revolves around the Patrick Smith House, shown here, from 1772. They also have a 1-room schoolhouse, an 1850s law office, exhibit galleries. This humble organization, with an operating budget of less than $100,000 a year, serves 4,000 students and half again as many leisure tourists. About as high a return on investment of any museum you'll ever see. Great stuff, including many local paintings by their local Hudson River School artist. Somebody that you won't find in Wikipedia, Helena Dewey Little, but she was great. She did great pictures, and they have about 40 of them, and just a really cool place. Again, there are hundreds of these community-based organizations, and that these historical societies are as distinctive as a thumbprint. While no 2 towns have the same narrative, no 2 of these organizations have the same stuff. And sometimes you'll stumble on something. You say, oh, well, that's a subject I've never seen presented before. And who would think of bricks as particularly interesting? But this is a town that had a brick industry. They also manufactured iron bridges, and I'll bet there's an iron bridge somewhere in Maine by the Berlin Iron Bridge Company. And they've got lots of other things, but they also did decorative bricks and terracotta and artwork. So there's sort of a sub-story there. And it's not going to be, it's not Picasso and Andy Warhol. It's not going to attract millions of visitors, but it's a deep thing. And if you lived in that town and that was your community's story, that's a cool thing to know. This is nearby in Bristol, Connecticut. They have actually a retired exhibit designer who does really fine presentation. You can see there, they do a lot with their industrial history, and those are the Conradson sisters. They were twins, and they're not, anybody would get a prize if they knew who they were. Well, I'll just cut to the chase. They were the gold medalists in the 1992 Olympics in synchronized swimming. And that's important if that's your life and that's what well, they were local kids, and so they are remembered there. Keene, New Hampshire, the Cheshire County Historical Society, town manufactured toys. They have a fabulous research library. They do a lot with ethnicity. They had art pottery there. Woodstock, Vermont, so they've got a lot going on. I love this. This is this artist on the upper right there, Thomas Ware. And another exhibit I'd love to do someday is portraits of artists by artists. There are a lot of self-portraits of artists, and there are a lot of obscure ones that have never been published. One of his coolest things he did a portrait for a family that is 14 feet long. And I don't know whether he gave them a quantity discount, but instead of doing all the kids, mom and dad, separately, they put them all on one canvas, and it's just kind of a wild, unusual thing. Vermont was into skiing, so they've got ski memorabilia. I think that's pretty cool. Local manufactured product. There was a Woodstock, Vermont piano manufacturer. This is also in Vermont, Morrisville, When our largest president ever, that would be William Howard Taft, was always nervous because he was so important. What if he shows up, what if you have him for dinner or you have him for an event and he breaks the chair? And so there are literally, I have now seen at least a dozen chairs in museums, and there are at least 3 or 4 around Yale that are remembered as chairs that were specially put aside for President Taft. And because he'd come to town and these folks would like panic, like, we've got to get it, he's a big guy, we can't have a problem. So that's the chair in Morrisville, Vermont. That's its story. That was the William Howard Taft chair when he made his way up to northern Vermont. In Winsted, Connecticut, this is one of the great federal period houses in the state of Connecticut. It's also the home of the Winchester Historical Society, local historical society. And just to show you how, I mean, when the Grand Army, everybody know what the Grand Army of the Republic was? Well, they actually were collectors themselves right after the Civil War, the veterans groups. But in that Grand Army of the Republic officially disbanded in 1958 or 9. And before that, many of the chapters had gone defunct because the veterans were all gone and their children were gone and they just weren't supporting it. So sometimes these collections they amassed got dispersed, and sometimes they would just donate them to the local museum. Well, this Winstead has this collection that was amassed by the veterans 120 years ago, and you just love stuff like this. You know, provenance officers' uniforms. That presentation sword, that's a photograph of the guy that owned it. I mean, again, it's just the layers of documentation. And if we were educating our kids to use this stuff, imagine the satisfaction a kid would have. History projects where they would drill down and find out for themselves, make that history themselves. Local industries, always a popular thing for local historical societies to do, and they made pins. Not anything particular. You probably could find those on eBay if you found them for $10, but hey, it's important stuff, and it's important to the story of that community. It was a town that manufactured clocks from the 1820s until the 1970s, so it had a 150-year history with the clock-making industry, and wonderful case studies of that. This is the old Stone Fort Museum, but Schoharie, New York is one of the most historic regions in New York State, just north of the Catskills. And this is another one of these museums that was founded in the 1880s that just, you know, makes my hair curl. And again, this is not state-of-the-art presentation. It's actually the opposite. This is like 19th century presentation, but it's like in Native American artifacts. The stuff that they've got is just breathtaking, including, I mean, I only learned this a couple of years ago. I lectured about the origin of the Germans in America. Why don't the Germans have their own Pilgrim Rock? Was the question, because everybody knows where the English started and where the Dutch started, and the argument was that this region in New York State is really where the German-American story begins. And you know, there are more people of German descent, I think, in this country today than there are people of English descent, and it's an important part of our national heritage. And they've got artifacts that report the beginnings of that story in the 1730s and 40s. Very, very cool. Lots of Civil War stuff I've never seen. That's a tintype there, which is very strange. These women are reading the news, which is something everybody must have done during the Civil War. You know, what's going on? The only way they're going to get reports is through the newspapers. And they're posing with the newspaper during the war. At least the one in the top looks unhappy. I don't know what those expressions suggest, but they're reflecting on the Civil War news, which many people did. Love this place in Conway, New Hampshire. My wife and I donated, that was our first refrigerator. They do a really cool thing with this house because every room is a different period. And they've got a 1940s kitchen, a Victorian room, and they've got these different things. And they're well curated. People know about art. Benjamin Champney, ring a bell? They got a lot of his stuff because Conway is where he was from. But they wanted to do this 1940s World War II era kitchen. And we gave them our refrigerator, and she likes it. She's pointing to it. And it's great. They just do such a good job there up in Conway. And they've got these incredible artifacts that people who know about New Hampshire North Country furniture, that's one of those famous Portsmouth tea tables in the lower right there. It's missing its feet, but it's still a great great object, and these are from Conway. Waldoboro. What's not to love about Waldoboro? The greatest acquisition I ever made, dollar for dollar. I bought for $900 in Damariscotta a mate to that table there in Waldoboro, and these were made in Nobleboro, and they have 2 of them, and there's now been articles written. There have been 4 or 5 that have been discovered, and they are these shell-encrusted memorial tables that incorporate photographs of family members and Civil War veterans, and they are just incredibly interesting. And that's better than the one that we had at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, but I thought that, and they're very proud of it, they show it. There aren't many objects that a curator can buy for under $1,000 that have that kind of staying power in terms of, out of their hooked rugs, which is something that is known to probably everybody down east here, and they're pretty cool. And this is in Taunton, Massachusetts. That portrait is by an important folk artist named Rufus Hathaway. That's Reverend Caleb Turner. And that's an important picture. And one of the world's records for a piece of painted furniture, $800,000 for a chest that is not as good as the one on the lower left, by this guy, Robert Crossman, who was a local, he made drums, he made that drum in the 1730s and 40s, really early, and he also decorated and painted furniture. So these are, these are some of their cool local stories. This is the Mattituck Museum in Waterbury, Connecticut, and it's a, kind of a state-of-the-art exhibit facility. It's really more of an art museum at this point than a historical society, but it wears both hats. And a few years ago, they got a lot of money from NEH, and they did all the things you need to do to raise a lot of money to do this incredible state-of-the-art exhibit called Coming Home, Building Community in a Changing World. I wrote a review of this where I described it as a machine for manufacturing citizenship. But since the 1930s, the city government has earmarked money every year so the students, they get those kids into the museum, and it's a relationship where the museum does not have to scramble and beg to get the kids to visit. The town is paying to make sure they do, and when they get there, they're getting something so remarkable, so penetrating, and so immersed in localism, and it matters because 60%, this is amazing statistic, 60% of the children in Waterbury today have English as a second language. So this is really important civic work. The Oakland Museum was probably the first history museum in the United States to really kick it up to the next level. And in their exhibition presentation technology, they just do amazing things. And I like the thing in the upper right was about how they make movies in Hollywood and talk about some of these interactives are like horrible. But they're really, this was a really cool one where they would have this videotape and you would see the action, you can see that screen there, what moves, and you can see a scene going on. They've got all these little toys that people used to use in the sound studios. You can record yourself making a soundtrack to the movie. And I won't, you'd have to have been there, but it's pretty darn cool. And they blend, this is a museum that's both an art museum and a history museum. They collect California art and they collect contemporary art, and that interplay between art and history is essential to me. It's really what the museum business is all about. The art matters, the history matters. The Midwestern state historical societies are so grandiose, nothing in New England compares to them. Although actually the Maine State Museum is pretty darn impressive. But in Kansas and Nebraska, and you go to Illinois, there's these gigantic, just mega state-owned institutions that also do really amazing work. So if you're ever in the Midwest and you think, gee, would the Nebraska or the Kansas Historical Society be interesting? Run, don't walk. They're all really well done. There's John Brown. We had to get to him. Carrie Nation, anybody heard of her? She didn't like people drinking. And these are just, these are just some of the displays. And I mean, you'll go in, they'll have these rooms that are like the size of, football stadiums with objects that are 20 feet tall in them. It's something, as a curator, I never could even dream of what it would be like to have a budget that would enable you to put on a show like that. They're really very well done. I think I've already mentioned time capsules, and it was great to see the Farnsworth house, just a couple more of them. I think the highest, greatest thing that has come down to us culturally are these houses with their intact contents. And if you've got a house museum where the collection was formed by the family, where they were pack rats that never threw anything away, where the archival records are intact, that is, you could just keep PhD dissertations spinning out for decades from places like that. They're so thick, they're so rich, they're so multidimensional and interesting. People who said there are too many house museums, those people don't even know this stuff exists because they haven't studied it, and they're rare. But Rokeby up in North Ferrisburgh near Burlington, Vermont, is absolutely fabulous. And this is one of the residents of the house. They have so many, I won't go into them all, so many backstories. One of them had to do with anti-slavery. They brought Frederick Douglass up there. Roland Robinson. In the middle there was an artist and a writer, and there are all these. And his sister, living in New York City, she came back to the family farm in Vermont, but she made a living, a fairly successful living as an artist in like 1905, pretty hard to do, and tons of her work, who never been studied. One of my houses that in Hartford, the Landmark Society, is the Butler-McCook house, which I described as the best documented house in America until somebody proves otherwise. Has a paper trail going back to 1704, and these people were so that literally if they bought a box of Kleenex, the receipt is still somewhere. They used up the Kleenex, but it was just the letters and diaries, and like their sons all went off. There were 5 of them in World War I. They all went to Trinity College, and who saves 100-year-old rotting sneakers, sporting athletic equipment? But they had like just everything. And one of the really cool things, this picture on the lower left doesn't do it justice, but the donor, the house had been in the family. House was built in 1784, but there's a lot of things in the house that were brought from the older house across the street that dated from 1690. So there were artifacts and paper going back to 1705 in this 1789 house. The last member of the family to live there was a woman named Frances McCook. She was a preservationist. She donated the house. And before she died, she was almost 90, somebody had the presence of mind to sit down with her with a tape recorder and do oral history. And she had just perfect enunciation and diction. And it's just like Ken Burns' dream come true would be a interview like this, where almost every word came out just like ready to print. So we did these digital excerpts where we edited some of these tapes and then digitized them. So you go into the room, you push a button, and she'll talk to you about the blizzard of 1888, or she'll talk to you about the Irish servants and how the Irish and the English. There are 5 different, and there are many more that could be done, 4 or 5 different audio tracks. And it's kind of amazing to have this woman who was born in 1871 speaking to you from 1970 in 2013. It's very cool. This is a project that I am involved with now. It's up in Plainfield, Massachusetts, up near the Berkshires, and it's another time capsule. Family was William Cullen Bryant's very famous New Yorker. Sister was married to the doctor that lived in that house. In terms of medical history and women's history, there was all these sort of interwoven stories. It's called the Shaw-Hudson House. But this is the thing that just made my head explode. I mean, this guy, Samuel Shaw, was actually trained in the medical profession by his father-in-law, Peter Bryant, who was William Cullen Bryant's father. And then he winds up marrying his daughter. This is his home-based medical office, not only with all his books and accoutrements and tools and manuscripts, but when Peter Bryant died, he left all of his stuff. Basically, this is the origins of the medical. Prior to the Revolutionary War, there was no medical training. Medical knowledge barely existed. So it really began to get a little more scientific and sophisticated around 1800, and this is absolutely the most extraordinary intact time capsule on the history of early medicine. Got to be the best thing of its type in America. Shown a lot of these. This is another great house, Clinton, Connecticut, the Adams Stanton House, another time capsule with thousands of objects that have started out life in the house and have never moved. No curators ever, they may have moved things around a little bit, but there's nothing been added or subtracted, and there's just these great things, including the earliest artifact associated with Yale. This is a small story, but Yale was actually not founded in New Haven, and the building it was founded in was demolished 1 million years ago, and that little wooden architectural fragment in the lower left is a little relic from that house. So anyway, it's just cool stuff. And this just unbelievable collection of women's art, samplers, and 3 or 4 family members, more than a dozen objects from one family, still in its original setting. Really cool stuff. Auspicious architecture. We're done with time capsules. This is another genre and a work of architectural art that has been preserved just because the building is so important. This is the story of the National Trust's property outside of Charleston, Drayton Hall, which was from the 1738, and probably the greatest Palladian house standing in America today, and one of the great plantation houses. And what's amazing about it, just like the Olson House, I've never seen this. The only 2 places I've ever seen this done are here today and Drayton Hall, houses with no furnishings that are interpreted really effectively. And that should be an impossible assignment. This place, this sells itself not so much on the Wyeth connection and the ambiance of that as just this drop-dead architecture. But the guides are trained. They walk you through, and by the time they're done creating these word pictures, you don't need I mean, it's great to have furniture. It would be better, I'm sure. They'd love it if it come down to them as a time capsule, but it really, really works, and it's just an amazing house. Portsmouth, New Hampshire. This is the least trafficked house in Portsmouth, and I think it's to me, it's the most interesting one. The Wentworth-Coolidge house is another run, don't walk, if you have never been there. Again, there are great houses in Portsmouth, and it's not fair to really, because they're all so great. But original wallpapers, the council chamber. This was Governor Benning Wentworth, the guy that put the New Hampshire. I mean, he was the epitome of the kind of why we needed an American Revolution. These people living really high on the hog with all their kind of royal trappings, and it's just an amazing house. They do a good job with it. Specialty museums. There are a lot of these places that on the surface of it sound like they're about something like trains or farming or something, but they really are also a community story, and it sort of depends where they are. This is the Hadley Farm Museum in Hadley, Massachusetts, and it was created in the 1930s by this creative visionary, a guy named Clifton Johnson. And I think good curatorship matters. And when I show you the next slide, you'll go, is that good curatorship? It looks like a hodgepodge. I will argue that it is. Some of these arrangements are actually quite artistic, but the assemblages of things and the comparisons, it's subtle. But the ability to give a guided tour in this environment that just knocks your socks off is largely because of the content of what's in this building. It's great. American Precision Museum in Windsor, Vermont. Nothing at the Smithsonian compares to it. I think it is the single best. If you're interested in the industrial age and high technology, machine tool manufacturing of the industrial age, it may not be a topic for everyone, but this is the best place in the country to learn about that. They have spectacular, spectacular stuff. We were in Osawatomie. I mentioned we went to Kansas. This is like a poor little shop front museum, but Osawatomie is a town like Gettysburg that nobody would know exists if something big hadn't happened there. And this was where, the Kansans argue this is where the Civil War began, because this is where the pro-slave and anti-slave forces started shooting at each other. And it was in 1856 in Kansas, and they do a decent job with it. In terms of art, it was also thrilling to see, and I think it's interesting, how house museums, how historic sites interpret art. And I think the novelty and intelligence of what you're doing with the Olson House, it's a great case statement. This is great. This is where the Connecticut Impressionists decamped for the summer for many years, and beginning in the 1890s, and they do a fabulous job. This was an artist colony in Old Lyme, and they do a fabulous job presenting that. And there's some really important. These are big name American, impressionists that worked there, and so So the art is great, and they've got a state-of-the-art gallery that is attached to it. So they do a really good job with that, and the house is impeccably restored. Well, nobody in the room will have seen this. This is a little more obscure, but in my view, just as interesting. Florence Hosmer, and women artists, as any art historian that looks really at this story of the Impressionism knows, the men kind of hung together. They had their little fraternities, and they promoted each other, and so the women were kind of left with what was the crumbs. That is in no way a reflection of the quality of their work, interestingly. And if I were younger and starting out with this, I think the great opportunity going forward is the discovery and aggrandizement of these women artists, because they outnumbered the men probably 2 to 1, maybe 4 to 1. There were a lot of women ramping up for careers in art in 1900, and they went to some of these art schools here in Maine and elsewhere. And this is Florence Hosmer, and she lived in Sudbury, Massachusetts, and she was good. She made a living. She had a studio in, I think, Rockport, or I don't, maybe Gloucester. I've forgotten the whole story. But in the end, she wound up leaving her house and 400 of her pictures to a community group in this town of Sudbury outside of Boston. And no, she's not, Child Hassam, and she's not the Wyeths. But the art is good. There's something to be learned from it. And where else will you see, they don't show all 400, but where else will you see 100 paintings by somebody who is a significant player in this pretty important art movement? These are not bad pictures. And one of the really cool things she did is she did this series on Salem matrons, old dowagers with lots of money in Salem, Massachusetts, and she'd get them to sit for her, and she'd paint them in their natural habitat, the picture on the lower left. And I just love that little kid. And this is the view from her house looking across at the church. These are pictures that if you put them in any art gallery with American Impressionists and didn't put labels on them and asked people to rate which were the best pictures in the room, didn't tell you who the artists were, some of these would stack up. They're really very good. I've got a bumper sticker on my car that says, "I break for historic libraries." And I've been in about 400 or 500 of them now. I actually do a talk on, as architecture, they're often important, but here's the kicker. These libraries predate museums, and they predate historical societies. So I wanted to do an exhibition on treasures from New England libraries. And because the stuff is amazing, and it would accomplish a preservation goal. I won't go into the details, but there are such great things in these libraries, and a lot of it's unpublished, little-known, important stuff. This is in Groton, Connecticut. I won't even go into, but those are some cool artifacts. This is an amazing library in Natick, Massachusetts, with this museum in the basement that has possibly the single most important Native American, it's an Indian artifact. I won't go into the details, but it is really a big deal. And then this is the thing that I feel like I need like medication. Every time I go to St. Johnsbury, Vermont, and walk back into this room, this to me is the most magnificent aesthetic experience in America. The Metropolitan Museum of Art does not measure up. You go in there, it is the earliest intact public art space in the country, best I know, 1872 or 3, and all they've done since they finished painting it and hanging it is dust. They've screwed it up not one bit. And it, among many other things, has the largest Hudson River School painting in captivity. Albert Bierstadt of Yosemite, it's like, I don't know how many feet wide, but it's just an amazing experience, and it's a gallery attached to the town library. So then, again, there are just the stuff. The other little exhibit that would be fun to do would be treasures from small museums. And I ran one. The New Haven Museum had, among other things, the earliest production model of a cotton gin in the United States, the earliest depiction of an African American, it portrayed with dignity and honor, not as stereotypically racist ways that African Americans were typically depicted in the 19th century. 1839, this was the leader of the Amistad Rebellion. It's a picture when I was struggling to save this museum, and that's another story, we were offered $5 million by the National Gallery for it. And in the lower right, there was a cannon foundry in Connecticut during the Revolutionary War, and there are only 3 or 4 of these these American-produced cannons from that period. So these are just little artifacts from that museum, but there's stuff, just the stuff people will save. I love the Lord's Prayer there, done with dental saws. And I just think sometimes, again, the chips fall where they fall. And in a community, you're going to save the stuff that's accessible to you. And there are aspects of our American experience that are completely, you just won't be able to find them if you don't look in these little places. And, what are we looking at here? As I say, I talk about these small museums are the Smithsonian on steroids, where almost everything is out on display. And I don't know, upper left is a display. There was a woman who was a veteran, an officer during World War II, and her uniform, her memorabilia, her documents. You don't hear a lot, you don't see a lot of artifacts. Civil War pickups, local industries, and then these are bricks, the lower left, they're bricks from the house that belonged to the first African-American family in this town of near New Haven. I mean, these aren't, maybe the most important objects in the world, but they're unique things. Of course, at the end of the day, what matters most is connecting with people. Here, there has been a sea change in performance, even at small museums that are run by volunteers. The quality of learning and public programming that goes on has increased dramatically in a generation, with hundreds of thousands of kids on school tours, lectures, workshops, field trips, salons, conversations about current affairs, book talks, countless ways of building social capital by coming together in special places to talk and learn about things that matter. Also to have fun, hearth cooking, concerts, theatrical, dramatizations. The revolution in public programming has been profound and will continue to grow. And I think you don't need to be the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In fact, one of the problems, I loved working, Wadsworth Athenaeum's a big art museum. We did too much stuff. We had 120 programs going on a year, and it was jamming the receivers. You couldn't, where in a lot of these small communities, they might have one, if they do 10 things a year, they're precious, and it's great. The X factor is people that have a passion for this stuff. Volunteers, docents, professionals, first-person interpreters, hobbyists, reenactors, scholars. What a platform, what a gift all this is. Too many house museums, forget it. Too much public money invested in searching for water on Mars, on sports stadiums, bank bailouts, bridges to nowhere, and more. The right answer is to ramp up funding for America's community-based organizations, arts and heritage organizations, and build a bridge to somewhere by finally connecting what goes on in schools with the bottomless pit of content and cultural resources that could be so transformational to learning and civic attachment. I just see it, I really see a bright future for all this stuff. But I hope we've painted a portrait that reveals not only the remarkable foundation on which our great memory houses and community museums stand, but the increasing vitality of the contemporary historical scene. The American Association for State and Local History and the National Trust are not wrong in pointing out the perils of our most ubiquitous genre of museums. There are literally thousands of them. Many depend entirely on volunteers who are not always replaceable. Some have failed, others will follow. But that said, I believe the glass is half full, the best is yet to come. Collections and contexts this rich are everywhere, and the evidence is overwhelming that it does not cost a fortune to transform buildings, collections, archives, and related historical materials into superb visitor experiences and beacons for community life. So why isn't the preservation of these treasures a priority? Clearly, those who labor in the vineyards of historic resources need greater self-advocacy. We need to inspire and make the case for this work more insistently. We need to get better at government activism, and we need to take our own side every chance we get, encouraging visiting friends and relatives, neighbors and associates to make time to participate and explore. It is our job to bear witness and inspire others to see that an affection for cultural resources is a pathway to civic engagement, neighborliness, patriotism, and even environmental stewardship. House museums and community-based organizations are indispensable and every bit as worthy of public support from foundations and granting agencies as parks, libraries, schools, hospitals, performing arts venues, etc. Foundations and taxpayer-funded agencies need to adjust, in my view, their costly procedures and abstract theories to accommodate the needs of the small, the local, and especially volunteer-run organizations that do so much of this work. The United States was the world's first nation founded on a shared commitment to fundamental principles and ideals, and the revolutionary idea of government is by and for the people. Our country isn't just a place, it is an idea that depends on citizens aware of and engaged with our journey of freedom. The idea of America is a beacon that inspires the world. I look at what we're doing. I'm so proud of this profession when I see the changes that have just happened in the time I've been in it. When I was in graduate school, nobody talked about, there was no study of African American anything. There were no museums, almost no museums that presented this stuff. And now more and more we're finding that you go to Colonial Williamsburg, you go to Charleston, they're not hiding, they're not pretending slavery didn't exist. They're presenting it with intelligence and candor. And it's very cool because what it does in a way that even our schools probably don't as effectively is soften this adjustment and healing that is going on nationally about how we talk to each other as cultures and races and people of different circumstances. And I just think it's been a very positive and ameliorating development that inspires me. You go to the Martin Luther King, don't just show the house. That's what they used to have. But the National Park Service has now built a visitor center that is incredibly state-of-the-art. They do all this stuff with the neighborhood. And this is in Atlanta, Georgia, and it's just, to me, it's very, very inspiring. This is one little final thing. And it was this sort of celebrity philanthropy that goes on. But when you go back to the 20s and 30s, the Steve Jobs and Bill Gateses of those times were investing in the education of American citizenry about its culture and its heritage, and preserving and creating places like Colonial Williamsburg, the Henry Ford Museum. Feel like we need a renaissance in philanthropy around all this stuff because it's not a lot of money, but maybe the case just needs to be made a little differently, and I guess that's sort of what I'm trying to do here. It is up to us to effect change. We are an army with outposts in every town and corner of the country. There may be 7,000 of these community-based organizations. It's the only facet of public history that is distributed so evenly across the country. The staffs, volunteers, donors, and most involved members of these organizations number at least 400,000. When you think about the Friends of the Farnsworth, not just the staff, but the members, the active members, the trustees, these numbers start multiplying. You know, maybe 400,000 is, maybe it's 4 million. And you look at all these causes, and I hate to say you need a lobbyist in Washington, but there's hardly a cause that doesn't have somebody out there beating the drum, and I just don't feel that we've always done that enough. Imagine if historic preservation and this army of passionate local cultural heritage champions were aligned together. What a force for advocacy that could be. What a powerful tonic for what ails our great nation to bring these two communities together. Small though we are many, and our work offers the greatest chance, in my view, of calling Americans to a higher sense of place, past, and community. More needed now than ever because we love our homes, we cherish the ideals of America, and we understand that good stewardship is imperative for us, for our children, and for tomorrow.